Toynbee says in his history that 16 out of 19 civilizations that have decayed from the beginning of the world until the present time have decayed from within. Lincoln always said that America would never be conquered from without. If it ever perished, and please God it will not, it would come only from within.
Travel along, Catholic pilgrims, for 1 year as we learn from Venerable Fulton Sheen, one of the greatest Catholic teachers in modern times. Join me, Amy Thomas, once a week for a short reading out of Bishop Sheen's book, Way to Inner Peace. Welcome, Catholic pilgrims, to week 20. For this week's readings, we've got a very interesting topic. And when I first saw the title, I was very curious and I thought to myself, what in the world is this going to be about? It's called Bread and Kings. And initially you may think, what in the world does this have to do with inner peace? But I think as we read through it and we dig deep into it, you're going to see exactly why this was included in a book on inner peace. And what's super interesting is that for maybe the last 2 months, my husband has been asking a question, and I'll talk about that on the other side of our readings, but he's been asking a question and I haven't been able to answer it at all. I just keep saying, well, that's just how people are. But I think this week, Bishop Sheen is mostly going to answer my husband's question, and so we're going to talk about that. So 3 points for this week to key into are liberty, surrender, and promises. Number 20, Bread and Kings. People talk most about their health when they are sick, and most about liberty when they are in danger of losing it. Despite all the pleas for liberty, it must be remembered that every flight from responsibility is a flight from liberty, and every denial of personal guilt is also a denial of freedom. Cabbages cannot do wrong, though they have heads. Calculators cannot commit sin, though they can do many things which seem to emulate human thought. Perhaps it is the very burden of responsibility which flows from free choice that makes so many human beings ready to surrender their great gift of freedom. This also explains the search for someone to whom they can commit their choice, who will do their thinking for them and relieve them of the awful burden of the consequences of their free decisions. This search for someone to whom neurotic minds can commit themselves explains the comparatively facile surrender of so many to totalitarianism in our day and age. 2 Russian writers of the 19th century foretold that this state of affairs would come to pass in the 20th century. One of them predicted that the leaders to whom free minds would surrender themselves would come from Russia. Solvay said that the leader who would captivate souls in our generation would be the author of a book on peace and security for the world. Millions would submit to him as the supreme authority in the political and economic sphere for no other reason than because he promised bread. Dostoevsky also foretold that Russia and the world would fall to the, quote, temptation of bread and power, unquote. One cannot help but contrast this search for a dictator or an economic king with our blessed Lord when he fed the bread to the multitudes in the desert. Having fed the hungry masses, they sought to make him king. It is ever in the human heart, when it loses its love of the spiritual, to worship those who promise full stomachs or economic power. They wished to make Jesus king in opposition to all the kings of the earth. Instead of surrendering themselves to him and his sublime doctrine about sin and redemption, they willed to have him submit to them. They did not want to be drawn up to him, but to draw him down to them. However sincere and enthusiastic they were nonetheless bent on pulling divinity down to the level of the human. Though he who was rich became poor for our sake, yet he would not be an earthly king by force. A poor blind man could stop him on the roadway to be cured of his blindness, but not all the masses, with their universal acclaim and suffrage, could make him king. Then he laid his finger on their error. You seek me not because you saw signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were satisfied. John 6:26. They sought him not for the higher part of their being, but for their stomachs, not for his morality, but for their economics, not for his saving grace, but because of the dormancy of the spiritual in their souls. When loaves are more valued than the divine power which multiplied them, when streams are more admired than the fountains that produced them, the world will accept any kind of a king who promises bread and plenty. Nor let it be forgotten that he who promised the spiritual did not deny bread to the poor. Our hopes and our liberties are sold too cheap when they are bartered away to him who feeds the body and leaves the soul unsatisfied. This is the problem. The whole world is dying of hunger. The Eastern world is dying of hunger of body. The Western world is dying of hunger of soul. The first will be fed, but not by those who hate liberty when they give them flour. The Western world will be saved by feeding the East while recognizing their own hunger of the Spirit and by seeking again the true King of Hearts who alone gives the bread of life. So the question that my husband has been asking is, why? Why have so many people followed communism and socialism? What was it about Karl Marx's writing, the Communist Manifesto, that made so many people say, yes, yes, this must be the way? And I have struggled to give him an answer, even though this is something that I kind of studied in college. And I've kind of just said, well, I think because it was kind of new, and people always like new things because they think it'll be better than the old way of doing things. And so, it was being pitched during a time when people were starting to lose their spiritual side, because at that point in time in the 1800s and the 1700s, there was that age of enlightenment, and people were starting to think that humans, hey, we weren't so bad, or we aren't so bad. We can do all of these things. Look, we don't need God anymore. And so when you remove God, something will step in to take his place. And so I haven't really been able to answer my husband very well until this week's readings. And I think what Bishop Sheen is talking about here answers so much. But before we get into that, I want to talk about a book. Now, most of you listening have probably read George Orwell's book, Animal Farm. If you have not, you need to put that on your list. It's not big, so, don't be scared off. It's actually a very small little book. But you do need to put it on your list because it is a absolutely prophetic book, and it totally speaks to the time. And it uses farm animals to show you the dangers and pitfalls of socialism and communism. So the whole book is centered around a farm. That's why it's called Animal Farm. And the farmer, his name's Mr. Jones. He has his farm, and the animals all work on the farm because that's what farm animals do. The horses do the plowing, and sheep are there for wool and food, and pigs are there for food. And, the cows are there for milk and all that stuff. Well, all the animals, and they're personified in this book, all the animals are kind of getting sick and tired of having to do, Mr. Jones's bidding. And so they want their own life, and they don't feel like they're getting fed enough, and they don't feel like they have enough freedom, and they want to break free. And so one of the old pigs, his name is Major, he has this vision, this dream that the animals need to rise up, get rid of Mr. Jones, and start Animal Farm and make it perfect for all animals. It will be a utopia. The pig dies because he's old. Old Major dies. But the revolt takes place. The animals are able to throw Mr. Jones off the property, and the animals cheer. They are so excited. This is going to be their farm. Everybody's going to have plenty of food. It's going to be low working hours, just enough, to get them by, to get the things that they need. But other than that, they're going to spend their days in relaxation and hanging out in the fields and just grazing. And so the pigs step forward, and there's two of them at the beginning, Napoleon and Snowball. The pigs step forward as the quote-unquote leaders, though they don't really call themselves that because nobody's in charge. Nobody's in charge. We're all free animals. We're going to be free to make our own decisions. And so very quickly, there's a couple of days where everybody on the farm, all the animals are just, thinking they've landed in paradise. This is going to be awesome. Very quickly, you see the pigs start to enforce rules. But it's always done in this is for the good of everybody. We, the pigs, we don't want to enforce these rules, but we must. And so, the rules apply to us as well. And they have all these rules and they write them on the barn and everybody's in agreement. And the pigs do a good job of, at the beginning, making everybody feel like they've got a say. And they have this song, and I want to read it to you because it speaks directly to what Bishop Sheen is talking about today. It says, "Beasts of England, beasts of Ireland, beasts of every land and clime, hearken to my joyful tidings of the golden future time. Soon or late the day is coming, tyrant man shall be overthrown, and the fruitful fields of England shall be trod by beasts alone. Rings shall vanish from our noses, and the harness from our back. Bit and spur shall rest forever, cruel whips no more shall crack. Riches more than mind can picture, wheat and barley, oats and hay, clover, beans, and mangel wurzels shall be ours upon that day." So what do you see that they're offering here? It's this utopia. Everything is going to be amazing. We won't have the shackles of those stupid humans anymore. And what are they talking about? Food. Riches more than mind can picture, wheat and barley, oats and hay, clover, beans, and mangel wurzels, I don't know what that is, shall be ours upon the day. So they're offering promises of, quote unquote, bread. Oh, your stomachs will be full. As you read through the book, I won't give too much away if you haven't read it. It's an excellent book. So well done. As you go through the book, what you start to see is a change. And the lower animals do have to work quite a bit. In fact, the pigs have all these projects that they want to start and get going, and they don't work on them. And they always have an excuse as to why they're not working. And other animals need to labor, but it's for the good of all. When we have this will improve our lives so much. And then the food is not, so great. They don't get a whole lot. And then one day they discover that the pigs have kind of been keeping some back for themselves. And, when they're asked, what's going on here? The pigs always have some excuse. Well, we are the brain power of the farm. And so we really need the food, because otherwise the farm just won't run. And the animals, they're just like, oh, okay. And it shows exactly why people buy in to these kinds of things. They buy into them because of promises of bread and security, right? Because they're promising that everything will be better. You won't be, misused by humans anymore. It'll be a utopia, and everybody wants that. And here with Bishop Sheen at the very beginning, he says, "Perhaps it is the very burden of responsibility which flows from free choice that makes so many human beings ready to surrender their great gift of freedom. This also explains the search for someone to whom they can commit their choice, who will do their thinking for them and relieve them of the awful burden of the consequences of their free decisions. So when Animal Farm first gets going, a lot of the animals just surrender their liberty and their freedom because the pigs are going to do all the thinking for us and we don't have to think about anything anymore. And they'll have these meetings, and if there's ever like one animal that's like, I'm not sure about this, something bad always happens to that animal. And it's interesting to see that when the animals try to like think for themselves or feel like something's off a little bit, they are either run off the farm, they disappear in the night, something bad happens to them. And all the other animals are just completely okay with relinquishing their freedom of choices and to think for themselves, because the pigs have promised bread and security and a happy life, and everybody else is on board. The sheep are particularly on board, and it's very fitting that he picks sheep as the ones that are like, whatever the pigs want to do, we're going to do. So as we read on, Bishop Sheen goes over two authors who basically hit the nail on the head with what they kind of predicted was going to happen. And he says millions would submit to him, the supreme authority in Russia, as the supreme authority in the political and economic sphere for no other reason than because he promised bread. And so this is what communism and socialism promise. Everything will be fair for everyone. No one will do without. The reason why capitalism is so bad is because you have bad rich people at the top, and they take everything, and then there's the poor people at the bottom and they get nothing. But with our setup, listen here, folks, it'll be the same for everyone, and everyone will have enough food, and everyone will have health care, and everyone will have free college, and everyone will have everything exactly the same, and no one will get more. And what do we always see? The leaders are like the pigs. They're always getting theirs while everybody else gets less. And they're tucking it away and they're hiding it away, and they have all the power. They make all the decisions. They don't create a utopia, and they end up living in decadence while everybody else is barely scraping by. And we saw this in communist Russia, right? But that's what happened, is they promised bread and paradise and everything to be fair. No one will do without. And people are totally willing to sacrifice and surrender their liberty to security like that. And on one hand, it's completely understandable, right? Nobody wants to be starving. Nobody wants to go without some very important necessity. We are material beings in that we have a body that needs food and water, shelter, clothing, all those types of things. And so when we fear that those things may be taken from us or there may not be enough, we are willing to give up some of our freedoms in order to be assured that we have those things. But oftentimes, and this is what Bishop Sheen is focusing in on, oftentimes the people who promise those things don't really fulfill those needs at all. In fact, they use that fear that we may lose it. They use that fear against us and gain more power for themselves. And the important thing to remember is none of this brings inner peace. None of it does. Whenever we sacrifice our liberties in order to have complete security, we're never going to have inner peace, because in relinquishing our liberties, our God-given liberties, and the right to follow God's plan and his will in our lives, whenever we relinquish that, we give somebody else power over us. And when that happens, we will never have inner peace. And what is so interesting then is that he talks about Christ when he fed the multitudes. And I had never thought about it this way, but the people are like, wow, this guy just fed our bellies. We don't know how he did it, but he just fed our bellies. Let's make him a king. And it is interesting that they aren't keyed in on the miracle so much as they are on the full bellies. I love that he quotes this line from Christ, "You seek me not because you saw signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were satisfied." They really wanted to follow Christ and put him up on a pedestal, not because he performed amazing miracles, but because in their minds he was promising full bellies. And that's what they wanted. And again, like I said, it can be understandable for us as humans because none of us wants to be in a situation where we're searching for food and can't find some, especially for, our children and even for ourselves. But it is interesting that it wasn't his miracles that they were focused on. And you have to ask yourself, would I have been focused on the bread part? Or would I have seen his miracles? We do today, for the most part, because most of us, especially in the United States, we aren't starving to death. And so we can see the miracles clearly. And we're like, whoa, he multiplied fish and loaves from barely anything. But it must have been totally different for those sitting and watching. And something interesting that I thought about as I was reading through this is, yes, we have those here in our country that are pushing for socialism and communism type things. And a lot of people are falling in line with it. And like my husband has said and wondered, what in the world makes people think that this is a good idea? We've seen it tried and it went really badly in the countries where it is practiced. However, because this is being taught in college campuses and things like that, I really do think it has become a way for people to virtue signal because we have removed Christ and Christianity from our lives. The idea that we need to take care of our neighbors, that Christ is the center of our lives, and he teaches us to love God and love our neighbors as ourselves, and we should be giving to the poor, feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, all those types of things. Because we have gotten away from that, communism, to a lot of younger people possibly, seems like a great virtue signal. They can say to themselves, but I want it to be fair for everyone. You don't, but I want it to be fair for everyone. And this is how we can do that. And that's just the everyday type of people who buy into this. They can see this as everyone will be taken care of. And wouldn't that just be wonderful? And the people who are teaching this at the top, the professors and those in the media and all those higher level people, they see this as a great power grab because that's just what it is. Because the reality is you cannot create this fairness in the world. But I think it has come to be a great virtue signal for those who lack a belief in God and don't follow Christian principles. And on the Christian side of things, I think what you see in the United States is the health and wellness gospel. There are so many times when I have looked at those preachers that preach health and wealth and all those kind of things. If you follow Christianity, you're going to have riches and your health is going to be great and your life will be perfect. I have wondered so many times, why does anybody believe this? What about reading through the Acts of the Apostles makes you think that that's true? But what are they promising? Bread and a paradise of some kind. Security. You're not going to get sick if you proclaim yourself as a Christian. You're going to have riches if you proclaim yourself as a Christian. So, you're not going to go hungry and you're going to have a big house and all these things. And I think for a time, people buy into it because they like the idea of that. And then I think their eyes are open because those things don't come about, right? Not everybody who goes to a health and wealth, gospel church becomes super wealthy and they find out, oh, wow, I did get sick. And, everything in my life isn't perfect. And so then they leave and somebody new comes into the church because they've bought into the promises of bread and security. The way that we truly have inner peace, and I think this is the key, is The only one who can truly promise us anything is Christ. He gives us bread for our souls, which is the most important part of us, because that's what's going to go into heaven, at least initially. Our bodies at the second resurrection will follow, as the church teaches us. But our soul is the most important. And that's what Christ offers, is the bread of life, his very body and blood, soul and divinity in the Eucharist. And he's the one that can promise us paradise in heaven. There is no paradise here on earth. And no man, no government system can create that. We just can't, honestly. And so anybody that comes along and claims to be able to provide that is lying and vying for power. And so if we want to have inner peace, we have to be critical thinkers. We have to think for ourselves. We cannot give up our liberty, our right to life and to speak the truth and to follow our faith and all of those things. We cannot give it up for bread and the illusion of security. And so we cannot surrender those things. And we have to remember that the only one who can truly promise those things is Christ. And so the last little thing I just want to point out from our readings is on the last page. He says, our hopes and our liberties are sold too cheap when they are bartered away to him who feeds the body and leaves the soul unsatisfied. So that's something that we always have to keep in mind. Let's never sell our hopes and our liberties to some person, some man, some woman who promises to feed our body and take care of all of our needs and wants, and they will totally make our lives easy and perfect. That is a lie, and we cannot ever follow down that kind of path. We can never sell those things too cheap or at all. We always need to keep our wits about us and only listen to the promises of Christ. That is all for this week, Catholic Pilgrims. I will see you next week for week 21. And until then, live the faith boldly and travel well.